It's not in the face! Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Hey, Not the Face with your host, John Nash, and your producer, me, Steffi Haynes. And today we are going to talk about what the election means to the UFC and to the fighters. We are also going to spend half of the show talking about big news in boxing. So we have two major topics here, and sandwiched in between, we are also going to take a brief look at what's going on with Conor McGregor's sexual assault / alleged rape. We must use the word alleged as well. This case is currently in civil trial, and lots of details. Some of them are brutal. They're coming out too, so we are going to look at that as well. But first, we're going to check in with John and see how he's been doing.
Fairly good. I'm a little, saw a movie yesterday. We went out to eat after, and I ate. I've not been eating a lot of sweets lately, and we had way too much dessert.
Uh-oh. What kind of dessert?
Well, I had a chocolate orange. I don't know if you've ever had those.
Oh, yeah, I have.
And you have? I got ate a whole one by myself. Did not sit
You
well.
ate a Terry's chocolate orange by yourself?
Yes. Oh my God. It was good, but man, I feel awful now because I try not to eat chocolate that much as I love it. I try not to eat that much. So, but
that's
yeah,
a lot
I'm recovering.
Of chocolate, because a Terry's chocolate orange is like an 8-ounce bit of chocolate.
I mean, it's like a baseball.
Yeah, it's big. I know. And it peels off in sections. I know. I've eaten one before and was wildly sick after.
Yeah, I'm not. I will hold off on that. The other thing, I had a chocolate chip cookie too, freshly baked. And so that you add those two together, and that's just way too much in one day for me. My old man ass should not be eating that kind of sweets.
Oh, goodness gracious. Speaking of old men, it's my husband's birthday today, so I am going to do something crazy and wish him a happy birthday here. So everybody out there, y'all can wish my husband a happy birthday too. But right now, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the election because it is over. President Trump, he's in and Biden's out. Kamala Harris, she conceded. What does that mean for the UFC, though? Because they campaigned pretty hard for Donald Trump.
Yeah, we are not going to comment on what this means for anybody else so that we don't get any political kerfuffle over everybody, because those people's political views are very important to them. But we're going to focus just on how it affects the MMA and UFC specifically. And this is good news for the UFC, the company. This is very good news for them because a lot of benefits, direct benefits that come from Trump's win. One is there's a reason why the UFC went all in to support Trump. The company, not Dana White because he's his friend. That's a different matter. The UFC itself, why they went and helped him, because there's a lot of things they could do for him. I think the first thing that helps, and it's going to come out of this, they won't have a problem with the State Department getting guys like Chimaev to come to the United States. I think that's the simplest and most clear-cut thing that's going to happen. I think that they will call up the White House, get through someone, and they will get him a visa to be able to fight in the U.S. So anybody that has a relationship with Kadyrov or any other war criminal, that might not be a problem anymore in the future if you have a direct hotline to Trump and you can get him specifically. And he's voiced like he's a fan of, guys from Russia. So I don't think he'll have a problem personally clearing those guys to come. So I think that's the first most likely. But there's a lot more. If people remember when they were doing the hearings about the antitrust settlement, the plaintiff's attorneys brought up a scenario where because injunctive relief wasn't at the table at the time, this is the previous settlement, that perhaps a different branch of the government could offer some aid there. That'd be like the Department of Justice or the FTC. And if people pay attention, you realize how proactive the Department of Justice Antitrust Division has been under Cantor, and how proactive and aggressive the antitrust, the FTC has been in antitrust under Khan. Well, those concerns that perhaps one of those federal regulatory bodies would step in and look at the UFC for antitrust abuses and offer some form of injunctive relief, that's now off the table for sure. Those people are going to be gone. So the UFC has no concerns there that one of the regulatory agencies will be looking at them. They also have no NLRB, National Labor Review Board, Relations Board concerns now. Remember when Leslie Smith tried to become an employee, the NLRB originally was going to look at her case and then they threw it out. And that happened under the Trump administration. We're back to that situation where the NLRB is going to be gutted, I'm sure. It might be ruled unconstitutional in a year or two by conservative justices. But why it's existing, they don't have to worry about them ruling fighters, independent contractors. I think the status, the classification of independent contractors itself is going to become broader. So a lot of other companies won't have to worry about that. So there's a huge number of successful or things that are taken off the table that the UFC has to be concerned about. You can keep going on the line. Legislation that would impact the UFC, specifically like expanding the Ali Act. That's no longer concerned. We go back to the FTC, the non-compete ruling that Lena Khan ruled that was being challenged in court. They don't have to worry about those court challenges anymore because that ruling by the FTC is going to be overturned by the next FTC. And so they don't have to worry anymore about the things like will the courts uphold exclusive negotiating periods or right to matches. The UFC can put them back into contracts because the FTC is surely going to retract that ruling. They're going to get corporate tax breaks. So the UFC is going to be happy about that because that's one of the top items for the GOP is a corporate tax break, lower the corporate tax rate. And the most important thing, they have a direct line. They have the president's ear for problems they have. So for the UFC, this is a massive victory for them.
Okay, I have a side question here.
Fire away.
Because of all of the gutting of the NLRB, the FTC, things like that, those departments of government that are really crucial to the Johnson case that's still there and to things that the UFC actually wants. So bearing that in mind, is there any way that the UFC can pull their settlement offer off the table now?
Well, the lease settlement, sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Finish your question.
That's the one I'm referring to is the lease settlement. Could they pull that off the table now?
The lease settlement, because both sides have agreed, is safe. It's the UFC wanted it. The plaintiffs want it. The only thing that can derail that now is the fairness hearing. If someone steps up and says, we don't want it, and the judge agrees with them. But the UFC, they can't, the court will be very upset if the UFC said, we agree to this. Take backs because Donald Trump won. So there's no possible real impact on the Lee case from this. The Johnson case obviously is another concern. There's potential impact from the Johnson case. But with the Lee case, that's the Lee fighters should not be worried of anything because of this election.
Now, is there any small ray of hope for the Johnson case, even with this coming administration change that we know is going to happen because Donald Trump has said it?
Yeah, I think there's still hope. It's not like it's hopeless. The problem for the Johnson case is the case gets riskier now because of Trump's win. And the way it gets riskier is not that Trump can interject directly into the case. Well, he could technically. We'll get that in a second. But the Judge Boulware it's still his case. Boulware's still here. And in some ways, the one good news about Harris not winning for the plaintiffs is that Judge Boulware suddenly can't get appointed to the Ninth Circuit, a higher court, and then lose him as the judge overseeing this case. So he's still overseeing this case, which is the fighters probably are happy to hear. The problem is that Trump now, with the Senate majority, is going to be appointing a ton of judges to the circuit courts, right? A ton of federal judges. And a lot of the judges, conservative Federalist judges, they lean in a direction that's especially the Federalist Society judges that are pro-corporate. They're also the judges that made the series of rulings, like the American Express versus Italian Colors restaurant, the big ruling that basically says you have to go with arbitration agreements when they're in your contract. Justice Kagan at the time, he had a dissent. And his problem was that he noted this about when we talk about monopolies, the monopolist gets to use its monopoly power to assist on a contract, effectively depriving its victims of all legal recourse. So he saw this problem, and yet the the Federalist conservative justices all still voted for this ruling, and it's been reinforced with Epic Systems and others. Now there's some hope. I think the argument is that because of certain rulings that maybe, and I think the plaintiff's attorneys had some thinking that this is possible. Maybe we can argue that because the case was pre-existing. In other words, if you have an existing case in place, you can't suddenly push on an agreement that would be unconscionable onto the workers, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the thinking is that, well, Lee is going, and then because Lee's a case, or Lee's in the court system, you can't suddenly force these UFC fighters, these Johnson UFC fighters that would be a member of the Johnson class. You can't force them to sign arbitration agreements because we already know that the UFC is potentially a monopolist because this case is proceeding. Now, you hope that judges would find that a sympathetic argument. The problem is it matters which judge hears it. And a judge could easily hear that argument and say, well, the Lee class hadn't been class certified yet. So technically it's not a class yet, not a case. And Johnson is a completely separate group of fighters. Therefore, these arbitration agreements stand. That's a very realistic possibility. And it gets more realistic the more hardline Chamber of Commerce judge you have to put in front of. And so if Trump can appoint a bunch more judges to like the Ninth Circuit and the Supreme Court potentially, the plaintiff's attorneys are probably looking at this going, man, this case, not that it's impossible, but our odds are getting lower and lower now. The optimism we might have felt is getting smaller and smaller. And plus you got to remember, first they got to get Judge Boulware to say that these arbitration agreements cannot be enforced, which seems very likely. But then you got to go to the Ninth Circuit, and that can take a while. By the time the Ninth Circuit hears this, it could be a couple of years in the future, and they could have several more, new judges appointed by Trump on the Ninth Circuit, and there also might be one or two new judges on the Supreme Court by then. The case, not just on the arbitration agreement part, but also the chance that the courts might look, if the UFC goes to trial, this case goes to trial, and the plaintiffs win, the chance of appeal gets even riskier because there's a greater chance that there's more conservative justices that might look at the idea of using wage share, which is a novel approach to antitrust, and say, you know what, that's not proper. We want to go back to the original consumer welfare standard only, and then they would overturn it. So there's all these greater risks are now introduced to the case, which makes it much more risky, much more nerve-wracking probably for the plaintiff's attorneys than it was a couple weeks ago.
Quick question. I saw something from our buddy Fred Garvin come across my timeline, and he said, by the time basic discovery and appeals are done on the Johnson case, Trump will be several years gone. So my question to you, is time on our side as far as the Johnson case, or is time the enemy right now?
Well, it's kind of might be the opposite, because by several years from now, by that time, Trump, because he has a complete GOP Senate, not a complete, but he has a majority, which means they can rifle through any justice they want. They'll have a lot more conservative justices appointed to the court by then. So the court you'll be looking at in 4 to 5 years when Trump's gone will be a more conservative court. The aftermath of the Trump winning the election, the consequences are going to last for a decade or two.
All right. So that's going to wrap up pretty much what I had in there for our election coverage. Now I want to talk about the UFC's new SEC filing. Can you tell us what that's all about?
Oh, well, they filed an 8K. Every quarter, they have to file basically because they have shareholders, they're a public company. They have to file the public information so the shareholders can look at it and see how the company's doing. They also had a shareholders conference call like they do every quarter, going over how the business is doing. And if you look at it, it's kind of not the unexpected. It's the UFC's. We'll focus on the UFC because it's a TKO. We got to remember it's a TKO is the parent company. And so it's WWE and UFC finances. And in the future, it's going to be PBR and IMG and all these other things now added to it. But if you look at just the UFC, financially, the company is doing as good as expected. Over a 9-month span, they are over $1 billion in revenue, about 50 million more than they did last year. Their EBITDA is a little bit higher at 622 million compared to 612 million last year. So the company is doing very well. They're seeing uptick and everything. What's interesting is in the last quarter, they actually had a dip. They had lower margins on they had lower revenue, lower margins, but that is mostly explained by, well, two things. One is they had 1 fewer pay-per-view and 2 fewer fight nights. So 3 fewer events in the quarter, which, with all so much contracted revenue, that's why the revenue took a sizable dip, a noticeable dip. I wouldn't say too large. And also they had greater expenses, they noted, because of the Sphere show. But they still were incredibly profitable. Even the Sphere show, they talk about it was the highest grossing event I think they've ever had. Wow. I have to double check that, but it was one of the highest grossing. Maybe it was for the year, but it did tremendously well on the gross. The problem was it had large expenses for the year. I mean, large expenses for the show, but they had sizable amount of sponsorship coming from Saudi Arabia, Riyadh season to cover it. So when you look at that, they did very well. I think that way to put it. And we can also, if you go deeper into it, it says something. It talks about their cash flow, just to show how much cash they're generating. They're going to have a big dip this year of 40% free cash flow. So they're going to have, around 700-800 million in EBITDA for the UFC, 1.2 billion for the company overall in EBITDA, but 40% cash flow. But that 40% cash flow is after they paid out 125 million into escrow for the class action settlement, their first payment for that settlement, also for their legal expenses, including the Vince McMahon case settlement. So after all that, they still have 40%. They're still looking at basically about $500 million of cash left over after they've done all their expenses, including taxes and all that stuff. So it's the company is, I guess there's one way to put it, they are rolling in it.
Wow, that's crazy. Quick question. Could this dip have anything to do with the antitrust case barring the settlement payment?
Well, the dip we saw in the, I guess for the third quarter was not caused by the class action, the antitrust settlement. I will say, if you look at their numbers, like their cash flow, the dip in cash flow, it definitely was caused by the payment out to escrow. Also for the year, just in the accounting of it, it looks like they marked down the entire $375 million this year as an expense. And so that's why their net income is actually a negative for the quarter. But that's just a one quarter. And then now they'll have it marked off net this year. They'll account for this year's books. Next year will be nothing but print money again next year. One thing to note too, they also had a $40 million expense, I think, in the third quarter related to the Vince McMahon and the antitrust lawsuit. And they're also, as part of that cash flow, free cash flow conversion rate, you got to deduct too, there was a large amount of expenses for their acquisition transactions because they acquired, they're acquiring PBC and IMG. So there's these one-time expenses.
You mean PBR?
Well, PBR. The one-time expenses that put a dip in the cat. But even then, even with all these extra, that just shows what a moneymaker it is. Even with all these expenses, they are seeing tremendous cash flow.
And that's going to wrap up our little bit there on the SEC filing. Time to move into some ugliness here. I mentioned earlier we were going to address Conor McGregor's case. You and I have been following this pretty closely. What have you gleaned from what you've read, heard, etc. about this case, and where do you think it puts Conor's career? To access the bonus content of this episode, you must be a paid subscriber. To do that, go to heynottheface.substack.com and subscribe today.
Ow! Ow! Not the face! Ooh! Okay, the face!